Here's a question about the conservative intellectual tradition and, well, what happened to it. Listen.
Hey Dinesh, I've heard you speak sometimes about the conservative intellectual tradition, but we see pretty little of that in modern politics and lifestyles. So I was wondering if you could expand more on what traditional conservatism is and how somebody could learn more about it.
Wow. Well, it is true that we're living at a time when there's very little appeal, not just to the philosophical tradition of conservatism. There's very little appeal to the intellect at all. What you have is simply assertion, and assertion unsubstantiated by context, by history, by even any kind of sophisticated argument. So we're going through a kind of, you'd have to say, a little bit of a low era. Now, what is it that American conservatism is trying to conserve? I've mentioned this before. We're trying to conserve the principles of the American founding. But see, that only begs the question, because you can study the founding. When you do that, you realize quickly enough that the American founding itself is based on a tradition. And so the conservative intellectual tradition incorporates that pre-existing tradition. Well, what is that tradition? As it turns out, that tradition is, well, you could call it twofold or threefold, depending on how you want to think about it. If you want to call it twofold, it's the tradition of the ancients and the moderns. And the ancients, of course, fork into two. The tradition of the ancients forks into Athens, which is the tradition of classical reason of ancient Greece and pre-Christian Rome, and Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, is the tradition of Judaism and Christianity. And then the moderns has to do with a more modern tradition that is defined by figures like Locke and Hobbes and Machiavelli and Montesquieu. And so what you have in the American founding is an attempt to bring together in a very interesting and unique way all these elements, which is Athens and Jerusalem and the emerging currents of modernity, as reflected, for example, in Locke, and to weave those together into what we now call a constitutional republic or constitutional democracy. Now, we can study each of these elements, and it would take, I wouldn't say not even a course, not even a year, not even 4 years, more of a lifetime to kind of get a full grasp of all the deep roots of this tradition. And this is why the conservative intellectual tradition is, in a sense, so rich. This is not simply a matter of finding one particular thinker and reading, Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia or even the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers itself has, as I say, multiple references that go back to the ancients and also go to the moderns and the modern tradition of modern philosophy in Europe. So what you really need in this situation is a kind of guide. You need a sort of philosophical guide, similar to, say, the Virgil in Dante's Inferno. Virgil is Dante's guide, leading him through the Inferno. Well, here we need a guide. And I would propose for that guide, at least for me, it's been the philosopher Leo Strauss, a German emigre who came to America in the 1930s or 40s, wrote a series of books. I'll do sometime on the podcast a kind of mini course or tour through some of Strauss's works, but here I'll just mention one, kind of a good place to start. It's this book right here by Leo Strauss, probably his most famous work. It's called Natural Right and History. What do we mean by natural right? We mean the distinction between right and wrong that might be given originally by God, but, says Strauss and says a very old tradition, it is inscribed in nature itself. In other words, there is a natural understanding of the line between right and wrong. Think of someone, for example, who doesn't believe in God or doesn't know anything about Christianity. They still can tell the difference between right and wrong. And Strauss's question is how? How do they know that difference if it's not being given by God himself? Well, this is a fascinating book, Natural Right and History. And here are a few other books I'd recommend that these represent sort of, I would call them the classics of the 20th century conservative tradition. I'd love to point to a 21st century conservative tradition, but alas, there is none. So here are some books I'd recommend, and they deal with different topics. There's, of course, Hayek's Road to Serfdom. There's Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Now, Nozick is offering a kind of philosophical libertarianism, but argued with great tenacity and wit. There's Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You can read The Gulag Archipelago, or an easy place to start, a much shorter, slimmer volume, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. There's Whittaker Chambers, Witness, a book about Chambers' own experience, his defection away from communism and toward the West, but put in the most grandiose philosophical terms by an extremely good writer. And then I've also mentioned, of course, Strauss's Natural Right and History. So a couple of other works I'd recommend. This, of course, moving closer to the direct tradition of the American founding I mentioned before, but I'll mention now. The Federalist Papers, an excellent kind of primer on the constitutional mechanics of government. Also, Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which is a 2-volume, but an excellent work. And finally, just the speeches of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was himself anchored in this great tradition. His speeches, although about issues of the moment, have a kind of deep philosophical current running through them. And Lincoln was able in a very folksy way to invoke that current. And so the speeches of Lincoln, I think, a very handy way to get an understanding of American philosophical conservatism.